The lion didn't bite. He dragged Jackson through thorns and dust, fast and silent, like he was running out of time. When they reached the clearing, what lay in the dirt froze Jackson's breath mid-chest, but what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The thorns clawed at Jackson's arms as he was hauled backward through the underbrush, the earth rising in clouds of red dust with every jerking pull. The camera was ripped from his shoulder and vanished somewhere into the thickets, the strap snapping like a gunshot. Branches whipped his face, tore his shirt, and still he couldn't scream. His voice was lodged in his throat, not from pain, but from the total disorientation of it all. The lion's jaws, massive and yellowed with age, clamped tight around the fabric of his jacket, not his flesh. That distinction was the only reason Jackson was still breathing. Malachi didn't snarl. He didn't pause. He moved with urgency, not bloodlust. There was purpose in the way he navigated the brush, avoiding roots and fallen branches, weaving between acacia trunks as if retracing steps long memorized. The drag marks carved through the earth behind them told a violent story, but the truth was murkier. Jackson was too stunned to feel terror. Instead, there was a chilling clarity to the moment, a primal awareness that told him, this is not an attack. But it could become one at any second. He stopped resisting. He had no strength to. He let his hands dangle by his sides and focused on breathing, counting heartbeats, cataloging every sound. Cicadas buzzed like wires in the canopy above. A vulture wheeled in a lazy arc overhead. Somewhere, deeper in the bush, a baboon barked sharply. But here, in this tunnel of motion and muscle and dust, there was only Malachi, the lion who should have killed him, but hadn't. Jackson's mind raced. What was this? Territorial aggression? Delirium from blood loss? Was Malachi confusing him for prey? Or was there some inexplicable instinct driving this beast to carry rather than kill? Finally, the lion stopped. Not abruptly, not with the ragged lurch of exhaustion, but like a creature who had reached its destination. Malachi released his grip and stepped aside. Jackson coughed, blinked grit from his eyes, and pushed himself upright. He expected to see a kill site, a feeding ground, a den of bones. What he saw instead was emptiness, a clearing, softly lit, shielded from the wind. Quiet. And the lion stood just beyond him, panting, blood caked down his flank, but watching, waiting. Jackson didn't move. Neither did Malachi. And in that suspended stillness, more haunting than any roar, was the terrifying suggestion that this wasn't random. This lion had brought him here for a reason. Jackson's breath hitched as his knees struck the dirt, the jolt rattling up through his spine. Dust billowed, tinged with the stench of decay and raw meat. All around him, the clearing whispered of death, cracked femurs stripped clean by time, skulls yellowed and brittle, the faint buzz of flies too fat to care they were being watched. And yet, in that fetid circle, the air pulsed with something else. Urgency. Not violence. Not dominance. Need. And it was emanating not from the cubs, but from him. Malachi. The great lion, once the rumored terror of Kalembe, now lay on his side, flank rising in uneven gasps. Blood oozed from his shoulder in rhythmic spurts, the wound no longer fresh but far from healed. Infection clung to the edges, pale green, crusted with soil. It was the kind of wound that smelled of inevitability, and yet he hadn't curled into the shade to die. He had crossed miles of thorn and heat and fear, dragging a human through the bush, not to kill, but to bring. To this place, to this moment. Jackson's gaze drifted downward. The cub. It was barely more than a whisper of a lion. Eyes sealed shut with grime, ribs pressing against paper-thin skin. its breaths shallow and staccato. Beside it, the corpse of its sibling had already begun to harden, a stiff curve in the dirt. Flies moved between the two as if they didn't know which would go next. The living one made a sound then, something between a mewl and a gasp. It was pitiful, primal, and so heartbreakingly human in its helplessness that Jackson felt something twist behind his ribs. Malachi hadn't looked away. His eyes, amber ringed in black, were locked on Jackson, not with threat, but with weight. A plea, a command, a hope. This beast who could crush a buffalo's spine was now placing the smallest, most fragile piece of his world in the hands of a man he should have feared. Jackson reached slowly, hands trembling not with fear, but with the unbearable gravity of the moment. The cub was warm, barely, skin slick with dew and sweat and death. He tilted its tiny head and let a few drops from his water bottle drip between cracked lips. It swallowed. Weak, but it swallowed. And Malachi exhaled. Not in relief, no, not yet, but in surrender. His paw shifted just slightly in the dust, touching the corpse of the other cub, as if acknowledging what he'd already lost. Then his gaze returned to Jackson, still silent, still waiting. There are moments in the wild when language dissolves, when instinct becomes the only form of trust. This was one. The light was already shifting to that copper tone that precedes dusk, when heat gives way to shadows and the air hums with change. Jackson knelt in the dirt, his knees caked with blood, some his own, most not, and stared at the creature before him. Not the cub, though it whimpered faintly in the crook of his arm, its tiny body barely strong enough to protest. No, his eyes were on Malachi, who lay stretched beside the bones of his dead offspring, still breathing, still watching. To anyone else, the decision would have seemed insane. The man should have fled, called for help, abandoned this madness to the laws of nature. But Jackson no longer believed in the laws of nature. Not here, not now. What had once been a subject to photograph had become something closer to a soul to witness, and Jackson understood, in the way only someone who has known loss can understand, that this lion was not asking for a miracle. He was asking not to be left alone in the end. Jackson's hands shook as he unscrewed the iodine. The wound pulsed with fever. He poured the liquid slowly, trying to ignore the smell, the sick, sweet rot of dying flesh. Malachi flinched, a low growl echoing in his chest, but he didn't lift his head. He tolerated the pain the way only something ancient and noble could, without sound, without resistance, without demand. Jackson dabbed gently with gauze, pressing cloth into sinew and bone, biting his lip until it bled. He rationed his supplies with the precision of a medic in wartime. The water pouch he'd brought for 5 days now had to stretch for 3 lives. He gave the cub drops at a time, careful not to drown it. He soaked a rag and laid it over Malachi's cracked muzzle. Every now and then, the lion licked at it, slowly, weakly, but with the clarity of a being still choosing to live. The nights were long. The bush came alive after sunset, with hyenas howling in the distance and jackals pacing just out of view. Jackson built no fire. He couldn't risk it. Instead, he sat between predator and prey, his body the quiet line that separated death from something that could still be saved. And he talked. To the cub, in soft murmurs. To the lion, in apologies and promises. To himself, in questions no sane man would ask. By morning of the 2nd day, Jackson's voice was nearly gone. But Malachi still listened. His eyes, though rimmed with exhaustion, remained locked on Jackson's face. There was no fear, no anger, only trust, and the weight of something that no one would believe unless they saw it with their own eyes. And on the third day, someone did. The crackle of radios, footsteps, gasps, a ranger shouting Jackson's name. He turned. Behind him, Malachi stirred but didn't rise. The cub blinked weakly in his hand. The rescuers stopped just outside the ring of bones, rifles lowered but ready. One of them spoke, but Jackson didn't hear him. He was too busy looking at the lion. Because when history arrived with its boots and its cameras, Malachi never once looked away. There is a kind of silence in the African wild that doesn't exist anywhere else on Earth. It's not emptiness, not absence, but something heavier. A silence shaped by memory, as if the land itself is holding its breath in reverence for what it once witnessed. Jackson Miller sits in that silence every year, in the same folding canvas chair, his elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on a shape in the golden grass ahead. Luma. No longer the fragile slip of fur he once fed water to with trembling hands, she now stands tall and sure, her frame sleek, her muscles fluid with the grace only predators possess. But when she walks, slowly, deliberately, to the edge of the enclosure where Jackson waits, she loses all pretense of wildness. Her ears twitch, her breathing steadies, and she sits. Right there, always in the same spot, close enough for them to see each other's eyes. Not touching, not needing to. That ritual has become the most sacred part of Jackson's year. The world had moved on quickly. News cycles churned the story into a parable. The lion who knew love. Pundits argued. Scientists wrote columns, dissecting behavior, analyzing probability. Could a lion form intent? Could it recognize help, request aid, display gratitude? Jackson never fed the fire. He'd endured interviews, stood on stages, received awards he never asked for. But when they pressed him for answers, for proof, he repeated the same sentence, always softly, always with the same far-off look. He dragged me because he didn't know what else to do. It was not poetry. It was the truth. Malachi had no language, no logic to map the situation, but he had instinct and grief. And in those final days, something in him had reached for the only creature nearby who might see, not just with eyes, but with heart. Jackson never forgot that moment. The nudge, that single deliberate push of Malachi's bloodied muzzle against his wrist, the way the lion's body sagged only after it was done, as if he had finally passed the burden to someone else. Now, years later, with silver in his beard and tremors in his fingers, Jackson keeps that burden close, not with guilt, but with reverence. Luma watches him. Her face is unreadable, but her stillness speaks, not of memory, of inheritance. Because some stories aren't passed down in books or legends. Some live in the quiet recognition between two creatures who were saved by the same loss.